It's the big spooky day once again, and a happy Halloween to all of you out there enjoying the festivities. Or if it's not Halloween, well, I still hope you have at least a kinda passably good day too. And to celebrate, we're double dipping on Fulci to see Halloween out in style by checking out another one of his more famous outings, 1980's City of the Living Dead, also known as The Gates of Hell, the first part in Fulci's somewhat disconnected Gates of Hell trilogy. And believe me, we will cover the Beyond at some point sooner rather than later. But Dan, what is the Gates of Hell trilogy? Well, that's a bit of a loaded question, but I'll give it a go. Basically, Lucio Fulci had a lot of projects on the go in the early half of the 80s, and in a 12-month window between 1980 and 1981, he realised that he was working on 3 films where his lead writer was Dardano Sacchetti, his lead actress in all 3 was Catriona MacColl, Fabio Frizzi was penciled in to do the score for all 3, but unfortunately he had to drop out of scoring the final part of the trilogy, with work being picked up by Walter Rizzati and Alessandro Blanksteiner, and all 3 films dealt with the through point of the Gates of Hell being opened, each gate representing a different aspect of hell, and our heroes for the films attempts to close the gates before they consume the earth. Bizarrely, it was only very late into pre-production that Fulci realised this was the case, and given everything had been budgeted, booked and filming was set to begin, he essentially just decided to tweak a few lines in the 3 films to vaguely bring them a bit closer together before cracking on, and referring to them as the Gates of Hell trilogy as a shorthand for that year's work. The films don't cross over into each other, there's no shared details or anything like that, and mild spoilers, but this wasn't supposed to have ended as a trilogy. The original intention was to have each Gate of Hell represent one of the 7 circles of hell, meaning there are 4 stories featuring other gates that we haven't even seen unfold yet. But the 3 films all share aesthetics, their representations of hell all look kind of similar, and the tone and style of these 3 films all do share resemblances. Though I would argue that House by the Cemetery does seem to have a harder, nastier, more violent edge to it when compared to the other 2. But hey, we're here to talk about City of the Living Dead, and City of the Living Dead we shall talk. So what's it about anyway? Well, the film opens in a particularly grey and moody graveyard in the small town of Dunwhich, H.P. Lovecraft reference ahoy, as a priest, Father Thomas, wanders through the foggy aisles looking particularly ill. In quick succession, he produces a rope, ties it to a particularly sturdy grave, climbs onto a gravestone and jumps to his death, hanging himself right at the spot of a weakness in the boundaries between the living world and hell. At first, it appears that nothing's happened, until the ground nearby begins to churn and with little warning, the dead begin to crawl from their graves. It's then revealed that we are in fact watching these events either in real time or shortly after they've happened through the mind's eye of a psychic called Mary. Mary and her friend, who is also a psychic, are hosting a séance with a group, and Mary has latched on to this key event, the energy for which is so powerful and malevolent that it knocks Mary to the ground, killing her instantly. The police are called to the scene, but they don't believe the people there that Mary died in the middle of a séance of unknown causes, and instead they point to 2 of the gents at the property who the detective previously recognised as being pushers. He believes either this parlour was a cover for a drug den, or that they spiked Mary, leading to an overdose. But everyone sticks to their story, and the surviving psychic cryptically points to the teachings from the Book of Enoch, a 4,000-year-old text that may hold the key to all this. Again, the detective is very dismissive until a screeching, regurgitating fireball erupts in the corner of the room several times, and even then he still isn't fully convinced. While this is going on inside, outside a reporter for the local paper by the name of Peter is desperately trying to get the scoop on what went on in the house, but the police guarding the doors are used to handling the press and politely but firmly tell him to push off, which he eventually reluctantly agrees to do. Meanwhile, back in Dunwich, we're introduced to Bob, an equally mysterious and ill-looking man who's wandering around a dusty and eerie backwoods when he stumbles on an old house. He heads inside, and after investigating a bit, he finds a self-inflating love doll and a rotting, maggot and worm-riddled dead baby.
Oh my god!
Traumatised and horrified, he flees the house. This will be kind of important, so do bear with. Still in Dunwich, we then begin to explore the various residents and storefronts of the town and the ongoing mysterious happenings that are occurring since the death of Father Thomas. At a bar, the patrons talk with the owner about how strange things are going on in the town, and the owner dismisses it. But then one of the bar mirrors shatters without cause. They try to rationalise it, and things calm down for a bit, but then a wall in the bar splits fully open and begins billowing smoke. Something they can't explain, so they all make their excuses to leave as quickly as possible. We're then introduced to Sandra and her therapist Jerry. The pair are deep in conversation about Sandra's strong feelings towards incest, as she claims as a kid she wanted to marry her father, and this has helped her develop a hatred of men. The session's interrupted when one of Sandra's friends, who works for Jerry, named Emily, says that she hasn't been able to get in touch with Bob, that he's a deeply misunderstood individual, and that she's concerned for him and may go to try and find him later on. They also explain that Bob is the way he is because his mother was a lady of easy virtue, and the town of Dunwich was, and still kind of is, full of puritanicals and witch hunters, and that Bob's mother was basically considered a witch by the town, and her death was under mysterious circumstances. This conversation's then interrupted when Sandra is randomly attacked by a kitten. No time for more incest talk though, we've got graves to dig, as we're back in New York and Peter has travelled up to the graveyard where Mary is set to be buried. He chats idly with the diggers while they do their thing, but as Mary is lowered in and buried, it hits 5 PM and with the grave still quite a bit off being filled, the guys take off. Peter can't quite believe that they'd leave a grave open like that, but it's New York, it's hot and they're off the clock, so he gets it, I guess. Unbeknownst to Peter, however, in the casket, Mary has just sprung back to life, and after some time trying to dig her way out of the coffin, she begins to lose oxygen. Peter begins to leave the graveyard, but hears some scratching and scraping coming from near where Mary was buried. He dismisses it, but can't quite fully get it out of his head. He begins to head back to the casket, and with a last gasp, Mary screams as loudly as she can. That gives Peter all the signalling he needs, and he grabs a pick and in a series of very near misses, breaks the casket open and rescues Mary, taking her back to her New York apartment. Her friend's very grateful for Mary's recovery, and after a wash and a change of clothes, the three sit down and both tell the full story to Peter, who can't quite believe what he's hearing. They explain that Father Thomas's suicide appears to have opened the gates of hell, and that if the gates aren't reclosed by someone who knows how to before it hits All Saints' Day, November the 1st, the dead shall never truly be able to rest in peace and will overrun the earth. Peter doesn't even know where to begin with this information, but Mary informs him that in her vision she saw where the gate was located, in a small town called Dunwich, which isn't on any maps. And what follows from this is a split path, with the majority of the film exploring the residents of Dunwich as the gates of hell grow wider and wider and the dead begin to take the lives of the residents in increasingly bizarre and grim ways. Father Thomas returns almost as a figurehead for the movement, and the mysterious, unexplained deaths of several women in the town end up being lobbied on Bob, as that guy must have killed them because he has a screw loose, which in turn causes Bob to go into hiding. Sandra and Jerry begin to experience increasingly unsettling scenarios and eventually conclude that something is indeed happening in Dunwich, and they decide to explore the situation for themselves. Meanwhile, Peter and Mary decide that they may in fact be the only people capable of stopping the dead from overrunning the earth, so they jump in the car and start to slowly try and figure out where Dunwich may be. And when the pair do eventually arrive in the town, there isn't a minute to lose, and teaming up with Sandra and Jerry may be the only thing the group can do to prevent an all-out apocalypse. In a surreal and vivid third act finale full of gross-out gore and grappling with the undead, will the group manage to close the gates of hell? Will Father Thomas scorch the earth with seething vengeance? And maggots? Maggots. 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 All over the floors and walls of Dunwich. All this and more will be answered if you check out City of the Living Dead. And as you can probably guess, with this one being one of Fulci's more notable entries as a director, this film's as unusual as it is engrossing. It kind of reminded me a little bit of Twin Peaks in the sense of the core plot is the kind of malevolent evil attacking the residents and descendants of residents who committed horrendous crimes in the pursuit of Puritanism. While the more whimsical comedy elements aren't quite present here, there's always this unusual, woozy, dreamlike vibe to what's going on. And even with that being the case, it still doesn't stop the film from really throwing a curveball when it does ramp up. The script, from my perspective, may be a bit of a Marmite piece for some. If you're not entirely comfortable with dreamlike pieces and plots that require you to kind of let go of the idea of the film being grounded in solid reality, then this film may be a real slog for you. It's a film that isn't completely away with the fairies, but you do have to get on with the idea that weird, horrendous things are going to happen out of nowhere with little to no explanation, and while it maybe doesn't quite go as surreal as Twin Peaks, it's definitely moving in that kind of sphere. If you are able to suspend your disbelief here, you'll find a story buried purposefully under several layers of subtext, wrong footing, and character pieces. It's a delightful little horror thriller with some giallo elements transplanted in for good measure. The distinctly Fulci flair of guts, gore and grime is absolutely present, and with this film coming out shortly after Zombie Flesh Eaters, it's clear Fulci must have had a really good time on that shoot because all the slimy, wormy, mouldy, maggoty weirdness is here in spades. What did surprise me a bit is how downplayed the zombies are in this film, really. They're always a kind of presence in the movie, whether they're just watching over people or getting up to happenings off screen, but they don't really become a seriously prevalent part of the plot until the back end of the second act. And even then it's a slow ramp up, with the actual harder zombie moments not really taking place until the final 20 minutes or so. I feel like if you're coming to this film for the zombie experience, then you may end up a little disappointed on that front. As while the zombie action in the back end of the film is more than worth the price of admission in my opinion, having to wait almost an hour to get to it may be a wait too long for some horror fans. I personally found the plot engaging, though I thought the ending, which I won't spoil here, was a little bit blunt. Not to go into too much detail, but the third act is a nice glide down to a conclusion, but that actual final resolution that ends things feels a bit turbulent and bumpy. It didn't have the smoothness that the rest of that act featured. And, to add insult to injury, they must have realised the original ending was a bit bumpy at the time, so they bolted on a second ending that muddies the waters a bit as if to go, ah. Well, I say no, not ah. I spent 90 minutes engaging with this somewhat bizarre woozy nightmare film, and I would have preferred to have had an ending that matched the energy of the production I'd just sat through, not a half-arsed, we'll build an ending in post with offcuts vibe piece that this film does end with. It's a shame really, because it does somewhat tarnish the film, and while I've now seen this 4 or maybe 5 times, and this time I thought it was better than the previous viewings, I still really got hung up on that ending. It's a problem that the other Gates of Hell films suffer to with varying degrees, but here it feels the most egregious. Beyond that though, this is absolutely one of the better Italian horror films to come from this era. The pacing is a little loose, but that's fine because we're sacrificing consistent pacing in the pursuit of that dreamlike vibe, which I think the film largely succeeds with. Act pacing is more or less to the minute, with the first act running for approximately 31 minutes, the second hitting 32 minutes, and the finale running for about half an hour or so. The transitions are coherent and seamless. I have no faults with this here for what it's trying to do. It works well. Tonally, the film's aiming for woozy horror, and I think it succeeds on that front. One of my favourite elements of this film is that despite the film taking place in the run-up to and on the day of Halloween, it's not really referenced as Halloween at all in the production. But the Halloween vibes are kind of immaculate. It's foggy, dusty, moody aesthetics throughout and would probably go down very well as part of a Halloween film marathon. The characters are all fine enough. We don't get much backstory for our core cast, which is a bit of a shame, but the film does try to give us well-rounded characters if nothing else, and I think it largely succeeds in that regard. The characters are all fairly diverse from each other, bring their own energy and presence to the production, which is quite unique for this period of Italian horror, and they all get their own character arcs and developments that I feel more or less pay off. The dialogue, however, is a bit harder to pin down, what with the way that Italian films are written, but I would say the English dub, which I watched for the purpose of this review, is actually pretty subtle for these kinds of things. Italian to English translations have a real habit of being a bit overly wordy, overly descriptive and weirdly phrased. But here, while there is some of that creeping in, it's nothing too heavy and it rides the line into campness pretty well for the most part, complementing the plot elements and ultimately giving the script just a fine sprinkling of light-heartedness to work against the darker themes, which I found wonderfully endearing. The script was written by Dardeno Sacchetti. He has 98 writing credits in a career spanning from 1971 to 2013. And a bit of a living legend to boot, with highlights including Cat O' Nine Tails, A Bay of Blood, Inferno and Manhattan Baby, to name a few. His work with Fulci and Argento is probably some of the more interesting films to come out of the Italian horror genre. And on co-writing and directing duties, we have Lucio Fulci, who we've already done a deep dive on both earlier this season in Zombie 3 and in some of my older reviews such as Zombie Flesh Eaters and The House by the Cemetery. An all-round good, if not inconsistent, egg. On the direction front, it's Fulci, man. Look, he clearly knew what he wanted out of this production, and working closely with the cam ops, lighting teams and unit crews, he's created a carefully curated and highly stylised piece that immerses the viewers almost immediately and will not let them go. Watching this in autumn at 1 in the morning in a darkened room alone will get you just checking over your shoulder. And that kind of atmosphere and tension could have only come from this specific period of Fulci directorship. It's superb, and the same goes for the direction of the cast as well. It's clear Fulci worked as best he could with the performers to get what he wanted, and while I'm not entirely convinced this is the best that could have come from this production, and alleged on-set squabbles between Fulci and some of the performers would suggest that this was the case, it's still a pretty solid attempt. The cast seem to have been given at least a bit of leeway on how to perform their lines and how to work with the set spaces, and the result is a piece that I feel could have stood to have gone wilder, but in some ways the more reserved nature of the cast helps complement the craziness happening to these members, rather than the members making the craziness. On the cine front, it's solid. Excellent experimental chiaroscuro lighting rigs, good use of rich dark greens, blues and reds infest suburban life here, creating a solid contrast, again tying into the Lynchian vibes of the whole thing. Shots are curated, carefully considered. I feel like there maybe could have stood to have been a bit more B-roll if I'm splitting hairs, and the ending feels like there just needed to be a little more there to help smooth over the ramp down into the end credits. But on the whole, this is a nightmarish vision brought to life with scalpel precision, and I think it's probably one of the nicer attempts at leaning heavier into stylisation and aesthetics with Italian horror. The edit is a little fragmented in places. I can't tell if it's intentional or maybe just a bit rushed, but the edit seems to jump around quite a bit, both to all the different impacted residents of Dunwhich and also to Peter and Mary's quests. I didn't mind it so much because I've seen a few films cut to this style, and sometimes it can work in the film's favour as being a bit disorienting, but I can totally appreciate how some folks would be less forgiving than me on that front and just see it as a film where the editor couldn't cut himself out of a paper bag. Would this film work better with a more linear, progressive edit that removes as much of the backing and forthing? Maybe, but you could also take about 20 minutes out of the film if you cut it that way, so I'm not so sure. Performance-wise, it's fine enough. It's hard to tell the vocal performance of the cast due to the Italian way of shooting without caring about the audio and essentially rebuilding the entire soundscape in post, but from what I can see here, the cast all surpass the usual standards of Italian horror and give some pretty solid performances. Probably my favourite performance here is from Antonella Interlenghi, who plays Emily. She gets arguably the meatiest role in the film, getting to spend half the runtime playing a fairly upbeat 20-something living her life and trying to care for and about Bob. And then half the runtime playing a malevolent role where she easily gets some of the spookiest scenes in the movie. The range she plays is fantastic. I feel she really stood out in this film way more than any of the other performers. She really puts her all into it, and it shows. Christopher George and Catriona MacColl as Peter and Mary have good on-screen chemistry. Peter's a little bit more street smart and fast-talking and open to a bit of a joke around, while Mary is much more spiritually minded, and across the runtime the pair complement each other nicely. With Peter slowly being opened up to the world of the supernatural and the seriousness that comes with it, and Mary loosening up a little and learning to share a sense of humour over the small things that happen to the pair on their trip to Dunwich. They both have great physicality and really play the characters as characters, which I feel works in this film's favour and gives many memorable moments. The supporting cast too also keep the bar fairly high. I don't think there was anyone here who I actively disliked, and no one really let the performances down. Even the dubbing is unusually consistent for this kind of film. It's clearly got a little bit of a campy self-awareness to the deliveries, but it's absolutely not trying to be overtly camp, which is where a lot of these films kind of lose it a bit. Instead, it's solid but unconvincing deliveries that put a smile in the corner of your mouth and make you feel like the cast are enjoying themselves, but not at the cost of the audience's enjoyment. And finally, the soundtrack. It's ace. Full-on synth prog, it's a similar deal to Zombie Flesh Eaters, but much more rocky. I loved it. It's atmospheric, distinct, and suits the tone of the film down to the ground. It's well used, really hits hard when it hits, and left me really wanting to try and find an isolated copy of this as soon as possible. The ADR work is a little over-polished, as tends to be the case with Italian horror films. It results in the cast often not sounding like they're in the locations they're in. Or rather, that while their body is on set, their voice is clearly in an audio booth somewhere. It's not inherently a bad thing. I personally kind of enjoy it when I'm in the right headspace, but if you're new to the genre, do be prepared for that, as it can catch some people off guard. City of the Living Dead was released in theatres in the UK in 1982 with just one cut, a kill scene involving an industrial drill. And, to be fair, that kill is probably the most graphic kill in the whole film. So, if they were gonna cut anything, that one I could probably understand. It arrived on VHS as a pre-cert, first by Interlight in 1981, though there isn't much information on that release, and then again as a pre-cert by Intervision in 1983. Remarkably, this film wasn't considered to be a video nasty at the time the Video Recordings Act came around in 1984, but I believe that's because the pre-cert versions also had the drill kill either cut down or removed entirely. In 2001, Anchor Bay would release the film on VHS and DVD uncut and in widescreen for the first time. And then in 2010, Blue Underground would put the film out on Blu-ray, with Arrow Video following not too far behind with a Blu-ray release of their own and a 4K release in 2018. I own the Arrow Video release, and it looks great. The picture's sharp with a good level of film grain, the colours are vibrant and really pop, and the sound quality is superb. This release came out around the time Arrow was on the other side of its peak, in my opinion, and it's probably one of their better releases from this time. With a rammed extras package including audio commentaries, interviews with multiple cast members and Dardero Sacchetti, film essays, trailers, and much, much more. The 4K release of this is arguably the best this film will ever look, and if you're a Fulci fan or just into Italian horror, it's kind of a must-own in my opinion. City of the Living Dead is an example of Fulci in his prime. That 5-year span from 1979 to 1984 would see some of his biggest and most memorable features. And City is as prime an example as to Fulci's mastery as you can get. With vivid and creative Cinean direction, a woozy and sporadic script that'll leave you guessing, fantastic scoring and solid performances, City of the Living Dead is a must-watch this Halloween season, and definitely worth your time. I hope you check it out, and happy Halloween!